Okay, so here we are now opened up our Eclipse framework, um, IDD rather. So we can see I have already a few different classes created. As I said, I didn't spend much time thinking about this, just wanted to give you an example. And I have a member class with ID name, maximum books, current books, um, and we have a constructor. You notice the maximum books you're allowed to borrow has been set to 2, which is unrealistic, but just makes testing easier. Current number of books a person has borrowed is initially set to 0. And then you can see, because we have all our attributes declared as private, the right thing to do, we can have accessors to be able to access them. um, and also we have accessors for getting the maximum number of books, current books, adding one to the number of books the particular member has already borrowed. Notice we are in the member class. And similarly, when a book is returned, the number of books on loan naturally will go down. Right, if you look at the book class now, it's quite a simple class as well. You can see it's got ID, which uniquely identifies the book. It has a title, author, status, whether the book is currently available on loan, possibly reserved, and so on, or written off. Uh, Date purchased, the date book was purchased or added to the library. Um, so all of these are initialized. You notice as part of the constructor, it actually takes a current date. When you construct a date without any arguments using the default constructor, the date will be set to the current date from the system clock. So then you have these borrow method, return method. So you notice here, in order to borrow, it's checking whether the status is on loan, and also whether the sorry, if the book is already on loan, then you can't obviously borrow the book. And similarly, if the number of books you have already borrowed is the same as the maximum you are allowed to borrow, then it says it throws the borrow exception. You shouldn't be allowed to borrow, right? If not, if this exception is not thrown, you add 1 to the count, the number of books you have borrowed, and the status is now changed to O. Presumably it was A before. Likewise, when you return, obviously when you return a book, if the book is already available, something is wrong. Or if the number of books on loan is 0, surely you can't be returning a book. It's just throwing an exception in that case. Otherwise, if the exception is not thrown, it deducts 1 from the number of books that member has borrowed. And status, obviously, when you return a book, yes, it's wrong here. It should be available, right? So when you return a book, it should change to available. I just copied this. I forgot to change this. So get status, as you saw, status is an private attribute. So in order somebody want to query whether the book is currently available, they need to use the accessor get status, and similarly for the others. I just had a print method just in case I want to print something, just print all the attributes of the book object, right? So the other main one that we have is a library class here. As you can see, I make heavy use of this Java collection framework, also using generics, right? So hash map, typically, if we are dealing with books, typically every book can be identified by a unique ID. Similarly, member can be identified by a unique ID. Now, ID is typically a string, and obviously the book or the member are the corresponding object. So by using a hash map, which says, I need this one to basically uniquely mapping a key to an object, hash map is very useful. So all you need to do is what is the key type first, followed by what is the actual object type. And then here, you even in the actual constructor, you need to specify. Obviously, it's using a default constructor. Right. So you can see in the yeah, I've got a few methods here, as you can see. Let's go through them quickly one by one. So I have two methods. One is called get member and get book. Notice that when a person is trying to borrow, he's going to pass the ID, right? So if you pass the ID as which is a string, what this basically does is to return you the actual member. Sorry, in this case, yeah, member object. So you notice that it's just using the hash map has a method called get. If you pass the key, it will give you the corresponding object. So that's why hash map is useful in this particular scenario. There's one possibility though. If you get an ID which doesn't exist, there is no such member with that ID, it's going to return you a null. So if that is the case, then you don't really have that member. It's a non-member. So you something is not quite right. You just throw member exception. There is no such member with that ID. Otherwise, it returns M, right? Similarly, we're doing exactly the same with a book. If an ID is passed, it's going to get a reference to that book object, and if it is null, that means if there is no such book object with that specified ID, then basically it's going to throw a book exception. You can't borrow a book with an ID which doesn't even exist in the library, right? That's what it's kind of convey. So otherwise it returns the reference to that book object. So you can see now when you want to borrow a book, there are a number of things that can go wrong. First of all, it could be a member exception, which we saw just now, that specified member ID doesn't exist, in which case it will throw a member exception. If the specified book ID does not exist, it's going to throw a book exception. And in case the member has already borrowed the maximum number of books, it's going to throw a borrow exception. So the first thing we do is make use of these two methods here, get member and get book, to get the reference to the corresponding member and book objects. So I pass the member ID to the get member method to get a reference to the member object. Same thing for book object. Once I have that, you notice that I'm calling the borrow method on the specific book object, passing as argument the reference to the corresponding member object. So that's how the method borrow was able to actually invoke the corresponding member object to update the number of books he or she has borrowed. Add book here is what a librarian would use when you want to add a book. Even here, you notice that if you are adding a book, that book ID should be unique. In other words, there should be no other book with that given ID. So you notice that it's actually calling the get method on the hash map books. The get method return you a reference. Now, if that is null, that means if there's no previous object with that given ID, everything is good. You just add that new ID, a new object, and the corresponding ID to the hash map representing the books. Otherwise, in other words, if there's already a book with the specified ID, then you are throwing a book exception. Hey, this book is not valid because it has an ID which is already one of the IDs of the books in the hash map. Same thing, exactly the same thing is happening here. I don't need to explain this. When you add a member, it's making sure there is no previous member with the same ID. If that's the case, in other words, if you cannot find, it returns null. You're basically adding it. Otherwise, you're throwing a member exception. Now here the get books. So this is here, I wanted to actually illustrate, you can also return an array list, for example. So for example, assuming there are 2 or 3 books with C programming or Pascal or Java or whatever, you want to view all the different books. It could be the same title, but a different copy with different IDs. So here what you are trying to do is to get all the books with a given title, and possibly you also want to find all the books which are available, and maybe you want to get a book that is in the best condition and so on, or the that was bought more recently. So all this method does is, given the title and the status, you notice that it's basically has an array list object constructed. At the moment, the array list is empty. It's going through now one by one every element in the hash map. So in order to do that, remember I was telling you a hash map has a key and a corresponding object. So here it's actually the key set will give all the keys of those objects in the hash map. And this BID says iterate through one by one. Now notice the key for the hash map was a string, right? It's basically ID is a string. So we are going through each and every one of those ID one by one. The for construct allows you to extract one by one. And all what you are doing now is to make sure that it matches the title that is requested by the user. In this case, the method is passed the title and the status. So if a title of a book in the hash map matches the title, at the same time, the status of the book in the hash map matches the status requested, then basically you will add it to the array list. So you notice the good thing with an array list is you need not specify the maximum number of this size of the array. The array can grow dynamically. This is one advantage of array list. The other one is that you can delete in the middle of the array. So all it does is at the end, it gets all the books with the requested title and status, put them into a array list and return back to you. So the list books here, as you can see, all it does is it's just making use of the previous method get books. So after getting the thing, it's just going through one by one, printing all the details of the book. So this gives you all the books, and you're taking one book at a time because it's a for. The for construct allows you to iterate through a list, and one by one you are printing the details of each book object. Remember, we had a print method inside the book class. So all what we need to do now is to write some test cases. So let's see whether we can write a test case for a book. So all I'm going to do is go here and basically choose, let's choose book. Let's look at the book method. And yeah, so the status and so on. So let's write a JUnit test case for this. So new, just go to a JUnit test case. So you notice a setup and teardown is clicked. This is automatically construct the object that you want to experiment with or you want to test with. And the teardown, in case that some connections have to be closed, then you will put it inside the teardown. Typically, you don't use this, right? So when you say finish, you notice it constructs for you a template, right? So what are we going to do here? We want to just test the book object. So what we are going to do is to write here, construct a book object first. So what I do is I will typically declare a book reference, book B. You notice is the reference should not be inside any of these methods. So all the subsequent methods can access the book object. So here, let's, in the setup, I need to construct a new book object, which I can then try to test calling different methods. So new book, and if you look at the book constructor take as argument the ID of the book, the title of the book, and the author of the book. So so let's say here I construct a new let's say S101 is the ID of the book, and the book title, let's say Java, and author, let's say Tim, right? So I effectively constructed a new book object, and I'm going to do some testing to see what happens. Now, what do you think the status of a new book should be when you construct a new book? So typically, the book should be available. So what I can do is to write some test case to make sure the book is initially available. So you notice there is a sample given here, and if you run this now, you will say the test failed because you haven't done anything. In a test-driven case example, initially all the tests will fail. One by one, they will make the test to pass. So in this case, I've removed that, and I'm just going to assert equals. So what am I going to assert? I'm going to assert that the book reference is B dot get status. So you can see I can have some method called get status. What do you think the get status of a new book that is just constructed should be equal to? No, I don't need to put equal. I just have to say assert equals get status, and I'm actually comparing it with a character which is available. Right, so far no problem, right? So I can even run this now to see whether this test passes. Sorry, the test has failed. Now let's see what's the issue here, right? So as you can see, I have constructed a new object, and okay, interesting. After constructing a new object, I didn't actually assign it to a reference B. So B assigned the value of a new book, right? So now let's see whether this makes sense. The book has been now made to refer to the new book object created, and then I'm calling the get status. Let's see whether it runs this time, whether the test passes this time. Okay. So you notice there's only one test, and it shows all the tests pass. In this case, there's only one test. So let's write a few more test cases. So what I can do is I can just copy this. So you can call these test, you can give it a name. So it will be test status, initial status. Right. So now what I'm going to do is to basically write a few more test cases. So let's try and borrow, let's see what methods we have in the book class that we are testing, right? So if you look at book.java, yeah, so if you look at the book.java, let me uh, delete some of the sorry, some of the previous methods were left open, so I just don't want to get confused with them. Okay, so I think that should be fine. So here you notice that book class, I can try borrowing, but the problem is if I want to borrow, I need to create a member object, right? And basically, as long as book is available, if it's on loan, it throws an exception. If it's available, you should be able to borrow. So all I need to do is, before I can test this, I need to construct a member object and pass it to the borrow. So what I can do is now I go back to my book test.java, And on top of constructing a book object, I can also construct a member object. Member, let's say we call it M1 or M, doesn't matter. So let's say I initialize this as part of uh, what is done before any of the test is called. Before each and every test, the method with annotation before will be called, allowing you to do the test, right? It's not just done once. I repeat again, it's done before each and every test. So here I'm going to create a new member object, new member, and I'm going to pass to it M101, and I'm going to give it a name, right? Member, let's say Charles D. Um, right. So what we can do now is try and write a test to see whether the borrow is working correctly. So assuming it's a new member, assuming there's a member, you should be allowed to borrow. So what I'm doing here now, you notice that each test should have a different name. So let's call it test borrow. So what I can check is, now let's say I call this object is B. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call B dot borrow, you can see. So B dot borrow, I have member M here, I can call B dot thing. So what do you think the status should be after I call, sorry, that's correct, B dot, let's look at the borrow. I believe borrow only takes one argument. Let me see why it's complaining. Yes, okay, so now if you look at the borrow method, this is one thing you need to be aware of. What exception does the borrow method can throw? It can throw a borrow exception, right? So what it means is, okay, what it means is the book test.java, sorry, the book test.java, sorry, I'm running out of battery. Um, so all I need to do here is to basically uh, make sure that when I call borrow, that I put that as part of the exception. So this is the wrong one, sorry. So sorry, this is the one that we were creating. So you notice that here I just have to put throws borrow exception, and now it doesn't complain. So after calling the borrow, then I'm actually going to check the status has changed to O, right? So after you borrow a book, obviously you don't expect the status to remain available. And let's see whether this test pass. Right, let's write a few more tests. My battery is running out. I'm going to have to run out and get some power to this. So you notice the two tests um, actually passed. Right, so sorry for that delay. So we can write a few more tests. One of the other thing would be, remember each time a member borrows a book, the number of books on loan will go up. So what we are going to do now is to write another test, try and see, make this member borrow a different book, 3 different books, right? So what we need to do then is to construct 3 different books. So you notice I just going to copy and paste this. Control V, Control V. So let's call this 102, 103. It could be the same author and thing, that's not an issue. We got 3 different copies, but each one has a unique ID. So this is B2 and this is B3, right? So all of them are accessible by all the subsequent methods, B2, B3, right? Once I have done that, so you notice it doesn't like B anymore, so I change it to B1, and same here, I change it to B1, so B1, right? That's fine. So the next test I'm going to write is I'm just going to get a member to borrow 3 books one by one, and by right it should fail because a member can only borrow 2 books at a time. So let's see whether that happens. So Control C, Control V, and you notice here I'm going to call basically b1.borrow. So all I'm going to do is Control V, Control V. So it's B2. It's borrowing the same member is trying to borrow 3 different books. Notice it's complaining here because you can't give the same name. So let's call it test borrow 2. So here, basically, I expect this to fail. So this is a negative testing. So what I expect is a borrow exception to be thrown because no member is allowed to borrow more than 2 books, as we saw. So all you need to do is just put expected equal. So what exception do you expect to be thrown? The borrow exception. Borrow exception dot class. So this is a negative testing. I constructed 3 book objects, 1 member object. I made the member to borrow 3 different books, and I'm seeing whether the exception is being thrown. If it is thrown, our test case passes, right? So you can see now I run this. Right, you notice all 3 test cases pass. 2 are positive tests and 1 is a negative test, right? So similarly, when you go to main one, that means the lib.java, you can also write a test case for this as before. Just go and file, new JUnit test case. So you just say libtest, that's fine, or libtest2, or whatever you want to call it, or libtesting, finish, and it'll give you this. So the same idea here, you would actually construct a few different book objects, few different member objects, try and call the different methods and see whether the exceptions are being thrown and so on. So I hope you got a decent idea what you're, how to use the JUnit. It's actually fun. Get started. One advantage you have with this test is it can become a regression a regression set of test cases, because once you have written them, even if you make changes in your code, all these tests you can check whether they all pass again. You don't need to do any work once you've created all these tests, right? Even if you're changing something in your program, you expect all the tests to pass again. That's why it's called the regression set, regression testing, right? Thank you. So I hope you are able to get started. Bye for now.